This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you again for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Alexis de Tocqueville said that the tyrant does not care if you love him as long as you don't love one another. And my guest today is Luke Sheahan, and we're going to discuss his book, Why Associations Matter, The Case for First Amendment Pluralism. So associations are essential for political liberty, for human flourishing, and for genuine community. But Sheahan argues that recent judicial decisions are increasingly subsuming freedom of association and freedom of assembly into speech rights. So freedom of speech, of course, is essential for political liberty, but it's not sufficient. It works in tandem with the right of association. First is just to strengthen venues for free speech, right? It's a lot easier to speak your mind when you're in a group. But the right of association goes far beyond that. It derives from our social nature as persons. So the right of association has an instrumental and political element because groups can dissent and resist state power more effectively than lone individuals. But it also has other political and social values that go beyond instrumental reasons. So the right of association enables authentic community and friendship, which is essential for human flourishing, but it's also very important for innovation, for scientific discovery, culture and literary and artistic productions, and more. So what we're seeing in these judicial rulings is a playing out of deep philosophical debates about the nature of the person and the state, and it's really promoting a false dichotomy between the state and the individual as the only two parts in society. So this follows Rousseau, who maintains that all individual attachments, family, religion, language, regional attachments, etc., are obstacles to human freedom. But of course, this leads to the lone individual who becomes subsumed into the Leviathan state. And when he dissents, he must be, as Rousseau put it, forced to be free. So we discussed a number of things, including the philosophy of pluralism, Alexis de Tocqueville's concerns that individualism leads to centralization, Robert Nisbet's work on community, decentralization, and the need to revitalize associations, and some of the arguments for free association from Aristotle, Aquinas, the Magna Carta, the American founders, and more. And at the end, we discuss some of the problems with communities, the oppressive communities, bad communities, problem of racism, and the limits of association, and the tension there between individual freedom, associations, the state, etc. So thank you again for listening. I appreciate all of you have taken the time to write reviews. Again, feel free to send me any suggestions or books or things you'd like me to discuss. And as always, please do share with your friends and families. I hope you enjoy my episode with Luke Sheahan and Why Associations Matter. So Luke, thank you very much for joining the Moral Imagination Podcast.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about your book, Why Associations Matter, The Case for First Amendment Pluralism. It's a really interesting book, and I think it's very interesting how you are both doing something very practical, making this case that we need to rethink associations and First Amendment and free speech, but also doing it in the context of sociological theory, especially that of Robert Nisbet. So let's maybe start out just with your opening case, right? You start out this very serious academic book with the line, in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. All right? You have a whole start with Harry Potter, and this is your beginning discussion for freedom of association. So why don't you just give like a quick summary, a main idea, and why you're starting with Harry Potter?
Yeah, so my book is about freedom of association and why it matters, and the way in which the Supreme Court has enabled the government to suppress association. So that is, they have not accorded it adequate First Amendment protection. And I open with my book with this discussion of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, because there's a very interesting story in that book. So in this particular Harry Potter book, the Ministry of Magic kind of co-ops Hogwarts School of Magic and the teacher of Defense Against the Dark Arts, who is Dolores Umbridge, who works for the Ministry of Magic. She refuses to adequately teach the students. So the students start their own student group where they will study Defense of the Dark Arts, taught by none other than Harry Potter himself, who has his own extensive experience fighting the dark arts. And then Dolores Umbridge finds out that there's something going on, so she suppresses these student groups. That is, she does not want there to be independent sources of authority that are providing students with information and with a source of loyalty that is separate from the Ministry of Magic. So I take a look at that and I say, that is kind of a classic example of tyranny in action. So Dolores Umbridge is very much a villain in the story, a bit of a dim-witted villain, but still a villain. She's working to undermine Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts. And the way she does it is by suppressing dissent. How do you suppress dissent? There's a variety of ways. One of the main ways is you don't allow individuals to have independent sources of authority outside of whatever the central power is. This concerns over this go all the way back to Aristotle. He warned that that's what tyrants did. First thing they do is they suppress private clubs. They try to diminish the influence of friendships apart from the allegiance to the tyrant. And so I take this and say this is why associations are so important for the infrastructure of human freedom. And so I start there because I think I see a parallel between what Dolores Umbridge and the Ministry of Magic was trying to do to Harry Potter and his friends and the suppression of their student group, and what I've read about in First Amendment jurisprudence.
Okay, so it makes me think of a quote of Tocqueville, something to the effect. I probably said it on this podcast before because I like it so much. He said, "The tyrant doesn't really care if you love him or not, as long as you don't love one another."
That's exactly right.
And you said that you referred to Aristotle as well. So you have this idea that freedom of association, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but your argument is that in the United States, we've seen a decrease in the protection of freedom of association, and that it's been, as you say on page 2, you say it's shrunk significantly as the Supreme Court has subsumed it into freedom of speech, before finally discarding it in 2010 in Christian Legal Society versus Martinez. So why don't you talk about the Christian Legal Society versus Martinez, but maybe first explain, that's a pretty strong statement, that freedom of association, first, it's a substantive right. That's shrunk and now is gone, you argue, in the United States, right? I mean, that's a pretty bold statement. Why don't you explain why you think that, and then how that happened, especially in CLS versus Martinez?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court first kind of coins the term freedom of association in 1958 in a case called NAACP versus Alabama. So there, the NAACP was associating in the state of Alabama. The state of Alabama demanded that the group to operate there turn over its membership list. The group refused, and the case went up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, well, part of this right of association, it's not textual, but it's in the First Amendment. It's implied there. Part of that right is the right to privacy and membership. So that is the group itself gets to decide whether or not it turns over its membership list or makes it public. Now, the actual associational right is much older. The court uses that term in NAACP, but there's the textual right of freedom of assembly, the right to assemble with others. John Inazu, an excellent scholar at Washington University in St. Louis, wrote a great book in 2012 called Liberty's Refuge, where he recounts the history and theory of freedom of assembly. But today, we call that right freedom of association. That's a much more common term for what our founders meant by freedom of assembly. So the court uses this term, freedom of assembly, in the NAACP in 1958. And then it starts to, instead of referring to it as residing in the assembly clause, it migrates that right to the speech clause. So that is, if you assemble, you practice the right of assembly in order to speak, it means you're practicing the right of association. Well, in 1984, it basically completes that maneuver. And it says you have this right to expressive association as part of your free speech rights. And then in 2010, after the court has kind of made this move, describing freedom of association really only as expressive association. So the right to, as part of your right to freedom of speech, your right to express yourself is the right to associate with others who believe the same thing as you. And so part of your expression is your joining of that group. So you can communicate that you're conservative by joining a conservative group. You can communicate that you're a progressive by joining a progressive group. You can communicate that you support gay rights by joining a gay rights group, and so on. And that's what freedom of expressive association is. Now, as part of that, the court said you can exclude people from a group if they're going to affect the expression of the group. So, of course, a conservative group should be able to exclude non-conservatives because that, of course, will send the message that the group doesn't want to send. And the court really confirms this in the Boy Scouts case from 2000, where it says, yes, the Boy Scouts can exclude someone who has taken a public stance on LGBTQ issues that differs from that the Boy Scouts wants to send. Then, in 2010, the court handed down Christian Legal Society versus Martinez. And there, the court, this case dealt with a student group at a public law school, Hastings Law School in California. The student group was Christian Legal Society, and Christian Legal Society required its members to agree to a statement of faith. You would recognize it as evangelical Christianity. And it also had a behavioral requirement regarding sexual mores and that sort of thing, which are basically traditional Christian views on these matters that have been taught by the Catholic Church for centuries and by evangelical Christians for centuries as well, regarding marriage and sexual matters. So they had these requirements for leadership and voting members in their constitution. The university rejected their organization application on the grounds that they had to accept all students. They had to have an all-comers policy. So any student should be able to join Christian Legal Society, be a voting member, run for office, all that, even if they rejected the core values around which Christian Legal Society associated. So it kind of, in hindsight, and the dissent in that case makes a big deal out of this, the university went on to then kind of retroactively reject some other constitutions from other groups that also had membership requirements. And what the court argues, the majority in that opinion argues, is that freedom of speech is still protected. There's no impingement on freedom of speech. So that is, every student in Christian Legal Society can express whatever view they want regarding Christian beliefs and regarding Christian sexual mores and all that. What they can't do is reject students from the group who disagree with them. And then one of the concurrences goes on to say, well, there's going to be no effect upon the speech rights of these individual members, despite the presence of a dissenting person. So basically what the court says is the public universities have created a limited public forum where First Amendment rights matter. And the court has been saying this for decades about student organization forums at public universities. But the very right that seems to me that's most important there is the right to associate. That is the right to form a group. That's what this First Amendment forum is for, is the formation of groups by students around whatever it is they want to form around. Playing volleyball, the Republican Club, the religious group, whatever it is. And the court has for decades been saying universities have to recognize any groups that enter that forum. You can't exclude religious groups. You can't exclude gay rights groups. There's several federal court decisions in the 70s through the 90s on that point. So you can't exclude any group based upon their beliefs. Now, the primary right at issue seems to me to be the association, the ability to form an association around values. But the court here says, no, the only thing that matters is the free speech rights of individuals. And the forced inclusion of a dissenting person is not going to affect the speech rights. And of course, the court is right. As far as it goes, speech rights, individual speech rights aren't affected. But that's not the primary issue. The primary issue is freedom of association. That's very obvious. That's what these groups are doing. These students are forming associations. So it's the right of association that really matters. But it kind of becomes clear in this case just how much the court's doctrine has mangled the idea of freedom of association.
Okay, so just to clarify, so what you say later, that what happened is that as the right of association became subsumed into free speech, as you just explained, the only thing that matters is whether you can speak. So as you say, this is on page 25, that we end up valuing institutions and associations only for their ultimate role in facilitating the function of democratic society, right? Only because they're expressive. So that the association becomes like an instrumental good for expressing yourself. But if you want to have an association that gathers together to do something that may benefit the common good, but not through expression, right, of an opinion or a belief in democratic society, that right of association has been diminished because association has been, subsumed, overtaken by free speech? How would you explain that?
Yeah, so basically the court is looking at freedom of association and it's only thinking in terms of democratic governance. So why does the speech clause get such attention? And I agree with the attention it's gotten. I like much of that jurisprudence. But why does the court give it that jurisprudence? Its own justification is the importance of individual speech rights of citizens for democratic governance. So we're going to have a democracy. We citizens need to hash out our differences and come to a consensus. And the way we do that is through unbridled expression. And I think that's right as far as it goes. But it's missing all sorts of values. And the court here is making that clear. So it's looking at freedom of association and it's saying, well, this only matters insofar as it's facilitating speech, because speech is essential to democratic self-government. So that's exactly right. The court is ignoring associational rights, and it can only see, the lens it has on only allows it to see an individual right here, the right to freedom of speech.
Okay, so let's get down to the core or the reason for your argument in your book. So that free speech is very important. We need free speech. We need to have free speech protected. That's essential.
Yep.
But you're arguing that we also need to have free association protected. And that what happened is that over time that we've lost this sense of free association and also assembly, as the founders talked about it. So what you're arguing is that we need to revitalize the right of free association. Am I right so far?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So we have an independent textual location for the right. And as I argue in the book, the right of association is not something that should be, or the loss of the right of association is not something that should be taken lightly. It's not just that we have a textual location for the right, as John Inazu has demonstrated, but that the right of association is very essential to who we are as human beings.
Right. Okay. So let's actually talk about that. I think this is interesting because you use one of my favorite modern thinkers, who's Robert Nisbet. And so we've had definitely Robert Nisbet episodes on the podcast before. And it was actually Brad Berzer recommended your book. We were doing an interview on Nisbet, and he said your book had just come out. And so when he told me about it, I said, okay, I've got to get Luke here on the podcast. So I'm grateful you're here. So you use Robert Nisbet, who really is making this case that what's needed for human flourishing and for political liberty, right? So it's both an instrumental reason, right?
That's right.
We need associations to be able to resist political tyranny, as you spoke about at the beginning. We also need associations because they're really important because we're social beings and that's how we flourish. And so what we need to think about is not simply thinking about it as speech, but thinking about it as creating the conditions both for democratic life and for human flourishing. And that by the court ignoring the textual precedents of assembly and putting it into free speech, it's actually closing the door to association. And so we should be attentive to that. I'm getting your argument?
Yep, that's right.
Okay. So, all right. So let's talk about free association and Nisbet. So this is actually, I'm going to just throw this out. One of the things that's interesting about association, so I'll often talk about looking like what is needed for, say, a free society. And you need various things. But one of them is the right of association. And so I'll look sometimes, for example, at St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote, I think it's 1256, a little thing called Contra Impugnates, where he makes the case for free association because the bishops were trying to tell the Dominicans and the Franciscans that they didn't have the right to teach in universities. And he kind of makes this argument that we have the natural right, because we're social beings, we have the natural right to join together in groups to do things for which we are competent. So Luke, you and I could, start a Nisbet society. Maybe we should. But we don't have the competence to start, say, a hospital that does heart surgery, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So because we don't have that competence, we don't necessarily have a right of free association there. So it's not this like completely unlimited. You don't have the right to have a den of thieves. But for things which you're competent, and this includes everything from businesses to charities to a host of nonprofit organizations and other associations. So this right is not simply something that's just kind of found in American, say, constitutional political documents, but this is something that is really part of the Western tradition and part of the idea of political liberty. That's where, and so correct me if you're wrong, but it seems to me that's where this kind of assembly comes from, right? It comes not just out of the founding, but that the founders themselves were part of a larger tradition of the right of association. And that this problem of losing association is more than speech, but also related to speech ultimately and related to political liberty. What would you say to that? And then we can talk about Nisbet.
Yeah, that's right. So the founders were thinking in terms of a much broader social right and social existence and the associations that took place there. I mean, interestingly enough, when you look at the debates over the Assembly Clause, it was one member of Congress, as they were drafting it, objected that the right of assembly was redundant. He said, well, if you're going to worship, obviously you're going to assemble to worship. If you're going to speak, you're going to assemble to speak. If you're going to practice freedom of the press, you're going to assemble in an institution that publishes newspapers and such. And the objection to that objection was, well, right. But the thing is the right of assembly has been suppressed. And he says it's a right that seems as obvious as whether or not one can wear a hat. And this is a historical reference to William Penn and whether or not the Quakers could assemble to worship. And William Penn, as many people know, in 1670, he was kind of infamously arrested for violating the law against unlawful assembly, for having too many people gathering to worship in a non-Anglican way. When this was, of course, on the forefront of the founders' mind, William Penn was a big deal to them. And so they were thinking of this long-standing right and the problems that happens when it's suppressed, infamously suppressed by the Anglican establishment in the 1600s. But they were thinking of the social rights, the right to be able to form groups to worship together or to do whatever together peaceably. And so they said, look, this has to be in the First Amendment because all of these other things will be undermined if we can't do this basic thing, assemble with others peaceably. And
you're worried that is actually starting to be lost just through small shifts over time.
That's right.
Where assembly is being, put in. All right, so I think I just wanted to bring that out just because I think sometimes, your book's focused on American politics, but I think sometimes we can forget that the right of free association is much broader than simply American political life, but it is actually part of kind of Western life. But so now you talk about Nisbet, and I think Nisbet's very important. And I think something that you point out is that the reason why Nisbet's an important thinker in this is because that what it seems to reflect, this move to free speech, is not simply the embedding associations into free speech, but there's actually something else deeper going on. And that deeper thing is that it's accepting a type of modern dichotomy between the individual and the state. And those are the two things. And that Nisbet and Tocqueville and Burke and others, but Nisbet's, I think, the distiller of this tradition in the 20th century. Nisbet says, no, we have to also think of the social, and that we can't simply have these two units, the individual and the state. And he says, you quote Nisbet on page 5, you say, Nisbet writes, quote, apart from the state's absoluteness, there could be no protective society, and man would sink once again into the dismal condition of fear and brutishness that had characterized his beginning. So he's kind of taking this he's kind of taking on Hobbes there, right? Like if they're right. And so he says, no, associations, man is actually a social being, and that he rejects this Rousseauian, maybe even Hobbesian too, Rousseauian idea that there's just simply the individual and the state, and that the associations get in the way of individual emancipation or of state order. But actually he says, no, there needs to be a third tension, and that tension of associations which reflect the social nature of man. You argue, why is Nisbet so important, and why do you think his work needs to be brought out, not just for, which I think is important, not just for theoretical considerations, but for actual practical legal considerations in American political life today?
Yeah, so Nisbet is one of the great thinkers, I would say, of the 20th century. Just absolutely outstanding. I think more than almost anyone else, he's able to see very deeply into problems that are unique to our modern situation. So he's very critical of strains in political philosophy more broadly, but especially modern political philosophy. So we're talking here Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau, and the like, who argued that the primary moral community is the state, and that its primary constituency are individuals separated from their social context. And not just that, but that social context, all the social groups that one is a part of, literally from the moments of conception, are in fact hindrances to the individual achieving their true nature, growing into themselves adequately. So Rousseau is very critical of what he calls partial societies. That is, these small groups that are not identified with the state. They could be family, they could be religion. Those are two he really takes aim at, and they could be anything else.
Regions or like linguistic communities. I mean, he was just, all those, if my understanding was so, all those were obstacles to human emancipation and flourishing.
That's exactly right. They all weigh down the individual in some way. They make claims upon the individual in some way, and that weighs down the individual, and it keeps the individual citizen from being a true human being. And the only way that to be kind of a full, flourishing human being in Rousseau's mind is if one is completely liberated from one's family, from one's religious community, and completely subsumed into the state. And then and only then are we truly free. Now, sometimes that requires, as he says, us to be forced to be free, to be forced to be freed of whatever prejudices those other groups have given to us, and to find our emancipation in the state. And he furthermore says the only point of any other groups is if they are facilitating state dominance. So religion is acceptable as long as it's a civil religion, as long as it's a religion in service of the state. You cannot have a religion that exists on its own. A Catholicism, for example, that wants individuals to worship and serve the church and Christ. You can't have, for that matter, Presbyterians who claim that the point of religion is to serve Christ and to come to knowledge of the word. You can't have that. You have to have only religions that will help to facilitate state power. And Nisbet, Rousseau sees a very strong connection between state power and individual emancipation. The way an individual is free is through the exercise of state power that frees that individual from these other social groups, family, religion, and society at large.
So then Nisbet says, no, we have to think of it in a different way.
That's right.
We have to think about the importance of associations. And one of the things, we've talked about before is, it's interesting. Nisbet, it seems to me he's relying upon certain anthropological presuppositions that he doesn't, that are implicit, right? So I think that's maybe a whole other topic to discuss of why we're a social being. But Nisbet, just sociologically and kind of, just in an observation, we're born into families, we're born into a certain place, we're embodied persons, we speak a certain language, et cetera. And he says, no, it's actually it's both a natural, so it's a natural right, but the way that man lives is in community. And that he's kind of resisting this modern move towards individualism. Tell me a little bit more about why you decided to use Nisbet for this, and maybe a little bit about how you use his philosophy of pluralism and why you think it's important.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I somewhat came across the thesis for my book accidentally. I happened to be reading Nisbet's famous book, Quest for Community, as I was reading the Supreme Court case law on these matters. And as I was reading Nisbet, and he's saying modern philosophy, political philosophy, has this dichotomy of individual and state. And the state acts as intrudes into these social groups to liberate the individual, but the result is an alienated individual. The state cannot provide the individual with this meaning. And as I was reading the Supreme Court case law, it dawned on me that Nisbet that's exactly what was happening in the case law. So I diagnosed what I call the First Amendment dichotomy of state and individual. So what the Supreme Court is doing in its First Amendment jurisprudence is it's saying, here's the state on one hand, and here's the individual on the other. And we can intrude into all sorts of social groups to vindicate the right of individual. And these rights of individuals matter insofar as they facilitate the state and state action. So hence the emphasis upon democratic dialogue. So the emphasis on freedom of speech and not freedom of assembly. Freedom of assembly is the right for basically individuals to form partial associations, as Rousseau would lament. The ability for individuals to stand aside from the dominant trends, including that of the state. So the ability to have what Aristotle would have seen as friendships apart, social clubs apart from the will of the tyrant or the will of the state at large. And that explained to me why the Supreme Court has been able to expand our free speech rights in ways that I think are very salutary, because it can look at those free speech rights solely as individual rights and solely as disconnected from associational rights. And it's why the court just drops freedom of assembly essentially since the 1980s. It hasn't even mentioned it. It hasn't brought it up at all or dealt with it at all in its jurisprudence, despite the fact that it's dealt with associations on a number of occasions.
The thing, it's really interesting that you did this, because in one sense what you're seeing, and this is not the only case where this happens with judicial rulings, but that the court, intentionally or unintentionally, is diving in and ruling not simply on speech or associations, but actually on this profound question of political philosophy. It's accepting as a foundation certain claims in political philosophy that are very debatable and have been debated for millennia. And almost we'll just kind of forget that. And I think it's interesting that you bring it up. And it's also interesting because Tocqueville, he talked about, and I talk about this with Brad Berzer on the podcast with Nisbet, this is one of the themes, that Tocqueville saw the connection between individualism and centralization, and that the state wants individualism to create more centralization, that those two work off of each other. And so what you're seeing, interestingly, from like a Tocquevillian perspective, and maybe I'm misreading this, but from this Tocquevillian perspective, that the court's actually taking this, we'll call it anti-Tocquevillian position, and actually increasing both individualism and thereby increasing centralization by pushing out associations.
That's right. That's exactly right. Nisbet's kind of the 20th century Tocqueville. So he takes Tocqueville's insights regarding associations and regarding individualism and centralization, and he takes them into the 20th century. And so that's right. So we often see individualism and centralization of power as opposites. But in fact, Nisbet says they're processes that work in tandem. So as you individualize persons out of their social associations, you increase state power. There has to be something that is able to intrude, a source of power that's able to intrude into the traditional authority of various associations in order to free the individual. So there has to be a centralization of power at the same time there's individualization. So there has to be, for the individual, an increase in one's identity as an individual and an individual citizen at the expense of one's identity as the member of a variety of groups.
But then this becomes really an illusion, right? This it's an illusion of freedom. So like you quote Nisbet on, let's see, page 37, where you say, quote, "Despite the American creed of individualism," which, by the way, is more complex than simply like that, I think, the normal way of thinking about it. But let's go back to Nisbet. "Despite the American creed of individualism, which locates motivation and achievement in the recesses of the individual mind and character, human accomplishment in almost any form is the product of association, usually in small and informal structures whose essence is a high degree of autonomy." And so if you think about it from simple ways to more complex, innovation, businesses, right? Charities, all these groups are actually people working together in association. This is where human greatness, where great innovation takes place. It's not really in the individual radical genius. That's rare, right? Most great innovation, maybe there's a great leader or a great entrepreneur, but it's a group of people who are working together. And so it's interesting because it's also an illusion of freedom, because you can have this Leviathan state and this tiny little individual. And how does the individual have recourse?
That's right.
To something? Well, generally by getting together with other people.
That's right.
And so, and whether it's a union, whether it's a political group or a political party or an interest group or the NAACP or whatever it was in the example you gave, you get together as a group to engage perhaps in civil disobedience so that you can get the law changed, right? But it's always associational. And so that's why it's like a bait and switch maybe. It's a false promise. We'll give you what appears to be individual liberation, but there's a cost.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. So these associations are the means whereby we associate with others, and much of what we think of as individual genius is almost always, extraordinary individual talent, but sharpened and focused by interactions with others, talented individuals. So great writers, Tolkien and Lewis, obvious geniuses, but their genius was sharpened and encouraged by their small groups, the Inklings and others. And this is true basically across the disciplines, and it's true throughout history. That when we look at certain periods of kind of the efflorescence of genius, Elizabeth in England and the scientific revolution and these sorts of things, what we see are the growth and diversification of associations. We see the founding of all sorts of scientific societies, and then lo and behold, these great scientists start emerging. But that's because they're around, these great scientific geniuses are around other scientific geniuses. They're associating with them formally and informally all the time. And that's where we're getting this incredible genius from. Right. You look at the founding of philosophy in ancient Greece. It wasn't some genius, Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, sitting alone writing. Right. It was, in fact, them talking to each other and discussing ideas, and they're getting sharpened in the group of them. And then the great ideas start emerging. And the same thing kind of in all sorts of other areas. So the founding of businesses. It's almost never a single genius who has some idea and alone builds a business. It's usually a genius who has friends and business partners, and they have a good idea, and they have people to check them and people to counter them, and they work together in this kind of vibrant productive association that then produces the great ideas and the innovations. And Nisbet says this is where it comes from, is these small, vibrant associations. And we have fooled ourselves into thinking if we can increase individualism, that is individualization, the separation of individuals from these social contexts, that we'll get the individual genius. That's not how it has ever happened historically. It's always happened in the context of these small, vibrant groups.
Right. I think, I want to move to Nisbet, but I think you raised an important point. I actually taught in an earlier podcast with Glenn Weil. We talk about, I wrote an essay a while ago called Ignoring the Invisible, and how all these things that are going on that we don't pay attention to enable us to have things that we just take for granted. And then Glenn gave the example of New York and the subways. He says, there's an idea in New York City that the individual is self-reliant and not like the suburban kid who needs to have his mother or father drive him around. The New York City kid can go and do all the things. He says, yeah, of course, because there are subways, right? Because there are streets and because there's order, right? And all of these things we're relying upon. And I think this is something that it's an interesting kind of psychological, sociological phenomena, how often we forget all of the things that we take for granted. We think they're normal because we're not paying attention to them. But every activity requires something. President Obama many years ago said something like, "You didn't build that," right? And a lot of people got upset about this. But if you really think about if you think about that word, you didn't build that. It doesn't, if properly understood, I don't know what President Obama meant by it, but properly understood, maybe he meant this, it doesn't take away from individual hard work of, say, building a business or doing something or writing a sonata or painting, but it's always done in the context of a society, an environment, a political life, and tradition that allows those things to flourish. And I think, one of the things, it seems to me, one of the reasons why Nisbet is important is he helps us pay attention to what I call the invisible. These things that are there, but they're so much part of our life, we forget about them. And I think he not only raises the importance of associations, but just the importance that we are in history and we are, in fact, beneficiaries of the work of lots of other people. So when our individual genius takes off, it's always in the context of some type of association.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Nisbet's work is essentially an attempt to recover that understanding. I call it in my book, the reality of the social. Remember that there's all these social groups around us that are making everything work. Why does our democracy function? Not because there's a bunch of individuals who can speak to each other. These individuals did not spring forth from the mind of Zeus or something. They, in fact, were brought up by families. They were now interacting in associations, free associations, as young adults and as adults that shape their minds and shape their thoughts. And then we end up with individual voters, as we understand them, who speak to each other.
Right.
So we have to remember there's this vast array of social groups all around us. And this is what Nisbet's talking about, and that individuals cannot do without. So one of the big kind of theme throughout all of his work was that individuals are primarily social, and they're primarily looking for community. Mm-hmm. They primarily want to be integrated into a community, and they articulate that in all sorts of ways throughout history, but that's what they're looking for. And if they don't find it, they don't find a genuine community, you end up with something that's very socially destructive, the alienated individual. So this is personally destructive for those individuals. Those individuals who are alienated, they look at society around them, and it's opaque.
Right. And then often they gather with other alienated individuals or with a demagogue, and things go even worse.
That's right. They're looking for community. And what does a demagogue promise? He promises community, and he points to some villain that's caused them. Why do you feel alienated? Well, it's this group of people over there who have taken something from you. Right. And I can offer you this community. Join me. And so that's a big problem. I mean, alienated individuals, if they don't turn
despair,
to despair, we end up with an increase of deaths of despair and suicide. And this happens in various social groups. And Emil Durkheim, who Nisbet looked to a lot and wrote 2 books about, I think was one of the first to do kind of the sociological studies on this in the late 19th century, but looking at certain groups that valued individualism and that had individualized have higher rates of suicide.
Right.
So people start despairing if they're not integrated into groups. Mm-hmm. And and there's social destruction. As you said, these alienated individuals can start banding together in what Nisbet called the revolutionary community. And I took that idea in an essay in Law and Liberty over the summer to analyze the riots that we're seeing. It's looking a lot like what Nisbet called the revolutionary communities, these alien individuals getting together, looking at the society around them, the religious community, the political community, and the military, everything they see, every institution they see, and they're saying, we want to overthrow it all and establish some ultimate community that will satisfy our need for some ultimate values that we can all gather around. It can be very destructive because it combines aspects of the political community, the religious community, the military community, and various social communities all into one thing. It's kind of one probably ultimate state is what they're looking for. And there's no means that they should abandon to get there. So they can destroy, they want to destroy the whole of the society, even things that we think were very good. Hence the tearing down of statues of Abraham Lincoln and the Massachusetts 54th. Those should be things that all people of goodwill see as real progress. The ending of slavery, that was a real good thing. And they see it as still a part of this corrupt society. So still a target. Every single aspect of it needs to be torn down because they're alienated from all of it.
Right here, I think there's an overlap between Nisbet and Eric Voegelin, who says that the driving force of modern politics is Gnostic, where we're going to figure out a kind of key solution to solve the problem of history. So it's almost like a double problem. It's not a new problem, right? This revolutionary community, as Nisbet talks about, and hopefully we're going to talk about the Social Philosopher's book by Nisbet in a little bit. But I think it even gets worse with the Gnostic modernity, this tendency towards ideology. So it even gets worse. Let's move for a second, and unless you disagree. If you disagree, you have a chance to say disagree. Okay.
No, I agree. And interestingly enough, you wouldn't think so just from reading Voegelin and Nisbet. They write very differently.
One is clear, one is impossible.
Yes.
Nisbet's so much clearer than Voegelin. You can read like 2 books of Nisbet for every chapter of Voegelin.
Yes, that's right. And Nisbet actually wrote a long review essay of some books by and about Voegelin. So he read him very appreciably.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to keep moving here. You have in your book, which I think is important. So, let me say, this is in one sense very theoretical. All right, we're talking about associations and Nisbet and Rousseau, but I also think it's incredibly practical. One, just for, like I said, being able to pay attention to how life actually works. But also I think it's just practical for the importance of keeping a free society, the importance of human flourishing, and on and on. So let's go. You talk about Robert Nisbet. You use Robert Nisbet as an example for this because you say that he has a philosophy of pluralism. You give 4 key ideas of a pluralist philosophy. And I think this would be a good summary. Like I said, there's 2 other podcasts on Nisbet. But he's such an important thinker that I think it's worth going into this. Why don't you go through those? The functional autonomy, decentralization, hierarchy, and tradition, he says, are these are the 4 elements of a pluralist philosophy. And tell what they are and then why they're so important today.
Yeah, so these 4 elements, so I'll go through each of them. Functional autonomy. So what that means is every social group should be, as much as possible, autonomous as to its function. So whatever its function is, and these functions are very diverse, whether it's organizing the proper worship of God or gods, whether it's procreating and socializing children, as the family does, or whether it's organizing the playing of chess or the social welfare society. Whatever the function is, the group that does that function should be as autonomous as possible in a pluralistic society. Decentralization. What this means is that the centralization of power in the modern state, as it is manifested over the last few hundred years, needs to be decentralized, needs to be not only moved from, say, the federal government to state or local governments, but from political power to social power. So from a central political power to the variety of social authorities that are carrying out these various functions. And hierarchy. So hierarchy, this is a very nasty word in our modern political and social thought, but it's actually, Nisbet says, it's a necessary part of every human interaction. So of course it can be oppressive, and we know that, but it's also necessary. So he said even in intimate dyads, so just a group of 2 friends, there's some sort of hierarchy. There's one that takes the initiative and calling or texting the other, and deciding where to have coffee when they meet. There's a slight kind of authority structure that emerges. He says this is necessary in every single group. Universities have presidents and provosts and deans and associate deans and chairs and full professors and associate professors and assistant professors and lecturers and senior lecturers. This is all a hierarchy. And you need this. You need a hierarchy of authority and function. And we need to celebrate that in order for all these different groups to thrive. And then finally, tradition. By tradition, Nisbet means he's talking here in terms of small t tradition, and he's talking in the plural, traditions. The traditions, the practices that emerge from individuals interacting with each other in a social group. So we interact with each other in a social group, and there comes about various practices that are our social way of being. So these are often informal, and they emerge from consensus and interaction, often unspoken consensus. But there's just a way of being that around certain groups. There's certain groups that you're a part of that always start 10 minutes late. There's other groups that is kind of very formal, and only the kind of official officers do things. This might be in your church or in some other group. And then there's some groups where the formal structure of authority, the actual practice, the actual traditions of the group are very informal. And he said we should celebrate the diversity of traditions, small t traditions, the way in which individuals have figured out how to live together and thrive together in a plethora of ways without central state authority. And they've been able to do it just through their interactions with each other in these groups. So these four tenets, I call them the philosophy of pluralism. Nisbet calls them the plural community. These give us a guide in helping us craft what I think are public policy, or in my case, I use them to craft judicial test that I call the functional judicial test as a way of solving this problem of the First Amendment dichotomy and First Amendment jurisprudence.
That's good. That's very helpful. Why don't you talk about that? I have a couple questions about just community and society, some theoretical questions. But one of the things you do at the end of your book is you make this case for the Freedom of Association Preservation Act. So you're using, I think this is just a good caveat to that right now. It's not simply a theoretical. You're actually using Nisbet and this idea of philosophy of pluralism to make a case for preserving associations in American jurisprudence. You want to just go over that pretty quickly?
Yeah, sure. So I craft a judicial test and I craft a sample legislation, Freedom of Association Protection Act, modeled after the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, as a way whereby we can protect associational freedom in contemporary jurisprudence and contemporary American society. So the reasons to do this are twofold. The first is the textual location of the right in assembly. So that's where I'm specifically putting the right of association, and the importance of associations, which we've talked about here and which I talk about at length in the book. So I think this move is necessary. And what I want to do is shift the focus of the judiciary and of public policymakers from the individual and the rights of the individual, as important as those rights are, to the social group when we're talking about associational freedom. And so what I say is we can do is have policymakers and have judges take a look at the functional autonomy of the group. So is this policy, is it impinging upon the functional autonomy of the group? Is it centralizing power unnecessarily? Is it somehow interfering in the authority of the hierarchy of a group? So it's telling the hierarchy, the authority figures in some group, what they can and cannot enforce against the members. And is it impinging upon the traditions of the group? So it might be that there's plenty of practices of groups that from the outside look unimportant. From the outside, they're opaque. Why can that possibly be important, that this group does this thing? Well, it might be really important from the inside. It might be really important that there's certain rituals or certain practices that have emerged from the consensus and the living together, the working together of some group that are really important. So I say these four things need to be protected and recognized in our current jurisprudence. And then I provide a way via legislation and via a judicial test whereby this can be done. And my goal is to shift focus when we're talking about associations from speech rights of individuals to the functional autonomy of the association in question.
Well, that's interesting too, because two things. One is you're not trying to do away with speech rights. You're trying to reinvigorate associational rights, both for their own sake and for speech, right?
That's exactly right.
It actually doesn't weaken speech rights as much as probably more at least in the way you've presented it. It probably strengthens speech rights more than it weakens it. Or do you think that? What do you think?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't have any interest in suppressing the speech rights that the court has developed. I think in many salutary ways. It's not so much that the court has developed freedom of speech kind of at the expense of freedom of association. It's developed freedom of speech, and it's kind of told us that our speech rights are kind of all there is. We don't really need these associational rights because of this, we have individual right to freedom of speech. And it's basically what the court explicitly says in the Martinez case. It says, oh, don't worry, we have speech rights fully protected. And it's like, well, that's great, but what about my associational rights that just don't have to do with speech?
Right.
What about those?
Yeah, that's very important. I mean, to lose freedom of association, Nisbet, or just thinking through history, I mean, this is the great tension of political tension. Does everything reside in the state, the king, the tyrant, however, or are there these competing groups who are both competing against each other and competing against the state? And I think there's the tension. I think you could see this even in some of the tension in the development of the Magna Carta. You see it throughout political history of its associations. Now, sometimes associations are bad, right? Sometimes they actually create problems. So, you're not suggesting that all associations are good, but that if we only limit our rights to speech and we lose the right to association, we're losing both a very important political element of a free society. We're probably weakening our speech in the long run, and we're also creating conditions for more individualism and anomie, some alienation, which can result not only to individuals maybe not flourishing, but also to bad kinds of community and false forms of identity.
Yeah, that's right.
There's a couple of problems that you address, but before I get to those problems, at the end, a couple times throughout your book, you make this distinction. I never know how to pronounce this. I've heard that Tunis. He makes the distinction between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft.
Oh, yes.
So how do you say his last name? Tunis.
Yeah, I think it's something like that.
You don't know either. Okay, good. Both of us don't know. I feel better. All right. Somebody knows, and it's not us. All right.
Yes.
So, all right. But this is actually really important. You make this distinction between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. And you say actually that Nisbet on purpose uses these words in German because they have a more precise meaning than the English. So let's talk about what Gemeinschaft, what Gesellschaft is, why they're different, and why you need both of them as opposed to just one, and because we kind of tend towards one. Why don't you do that for us?
Yeah, so Gemeinschaft is generally translated as community. What it means is the sort of personal types of communities. So the family would be the prototypical type of Gemeinschaft. So that is embodied, it involves the individual and their total person, as your family does, and as your religious group does. Gesellschaft is not personal. It's generally translated as society. But what it means is the types of associations that only involve you in one aspect of your life. So your employer is
Right.
kind of the typical example of this. So you work for somebody, they send you a paycheck. That's just kind of one type of your identity. Whereas your family involves you economically, probably religiously, culturally, biologically for the most part, and it's all sorts of legal relationships. So it's very much a total person is involved in Gemeinschaft. And Gesellschaft, it's much more loose how we relate to each other. And society as a whole can trend towards having associations that are one or the other. And so we kind of need both because we want to have close personal relationships like Gemeinschaft, but you can't have very many of those. You can have your family,
Right.
you can have your church, maybe one or two others, but that's it. But Gesellschaft, you can accomplish all sorts of things through various Gesellschaft associations. So being a part of your work, of course, but you may be a part of a professional association, a part of maybe a political association, and of course, part of the state. Probably it should be anyway, a Gesellschaft type association. So you have your political citizenship, you vote, you pay some taxes, and that's about it. Now we can have a problem is when the state starts claiming that it's the Gemeinschaft association. Well, if it's going to make that claim, that means it's a rival to your family, it's a rival to your church, and it is more important to you. It has to be more important to you than your workplace, and then all sorts of other Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft associations throughout your life. And so Nisbet sees this as a sort of trend in modern society, where the state is not just the thing we're all citizens of. It makes certain claims upon us and provides certain benefits, and we should be loyal to it to a certain extent. And instead makes the claim that it is the primary association, not your family, not your religion, not your local community, not your neighborhood, not your profession, not anything else. It is the Gemeinschaft association. And he says, this is a dangerous move here.
Yeah, so I think the couple things that made me think of as you talked about this. One is like back to Rousseau, right? So for Rousseau, he identifies the community with the political community. So the deepest experience of Gemeinschaft, of community, is found in the state, right? That's the kind of Rousseauian move.
Yep.
And I think it's interesting that you point out that doesn't just undermine Gemeinschaft or community, it also undermines Gesellschaft, society, other types of relationships. So in one sense, like there's a place for sometimes what they're called thick and thin relationships, right? So there's a place for thin relationships, right? So you go buy something, you have a thin relationship, but there's a little contractual thing going on. You have people working together in a business. It's not very thick, but it's a kind of social relationship. And it also helps build trust and a host of other things. And then you go into deeper relationships that are, as you said, fewer and far between, which are real community. And I think maybe there's even a third level. I have to think this through, so I'm thinking out loud a little bit. But, Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, makes some distinctions between communitas and communio. And I think it's interesting because I think one of the problems we're facing in society now is just confusion about what makes community and what makes a Gemeinschaft, a community, or a Gesellschaft, and what the state is. So, like, for example, one thing people often talk about, like, welcome to our business. It's a family here. And, well, no, it's actually not a family.
That's right.
It's right. So I'm just finishing an essay. Hopefully it'll be finished by this time when this comes out. But I'm finishing an essay on why it's not a family. And the three reasons are why you should not call a business a family. Number one, it's not true and everybody knows it. So, right, because you don't usually get fired from your family. Two, it actually undermines what a family is, but it also undermines what a business is, right? Because a business is a community of persons. It would be an experience of communitas, right? But not communio. It would be Gesellschaft, but not Gemeinschaft.
That's right.
I think in that, and then the third reason is, I think more in a sense practical for management, is that it's such a false aspiration or unattainable aspiration, right? That no one's actually going to treat their employees or their whoever, if you manage someone like they're your family. And if you do, it's either going to be harmful to them, right? Because you're maybe going to be too soft or too hard in an appropriate way. But also, you're just not going to do that. So what happens is the aspiration is so high that I think it actually opens the door to worse behavior. It would be much better to have an attainable aspiration, okay?
Right.
But anyway, that's a whole other thing. But I think it's just one example of how often we confuse what a communio relationship is, right? Then Wojtyła's language, which is very like deep and personal, intersubjective. A communitas relationship was more like Gesellschaft for sure, where you have the kind of thin relationships, and then of course what the state is. So, but I think I think it's important to be able to make these distinctions, because otherwise you fall into this Rousseauian error where you begin to think of the state as the community. Now, I'm going to go from there to ask you a question. One of the things that I like about Nisbet, and I don't remember actually if I talked to this about with Brad Berzer or not. So, but one of the things I like about Nisbet is he's different from a lot of the other sociologists of his time who are communitarians, because I think they, for all their talk of society, fall a little bit into the Rousseauian trap. And Nisbet, I think, is really almost stands alone among sociologists as focusing on associations. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not an expert on the rest of them, but my sense is that actually, and I can speak to my own discipline, much of what is talked about in communitarian circles and in terms of society and all that, they're thinking in Rousseauian terms. So they're not saying, individual rights are great. They're saying, no, we need a community. but they still mean it in a political sense.
Yeah.
So we citizens should look at each other, as more than just, fellow individuals. In fact, we should see each other as a community. And Nisbet's saying, no, that's actually probably anathema to what we're thinking about a true community, a way in which individuals can be truly integrated into a group needs to be social and not political. Political will only ever be, and if it's going to be healthy, Gesellschaft and not Gemeinschaft. And we need these other associations to be healthy. And what we need is a state that does not intrude upon the authority and the internal integrity of all of these other groups. And in fact, for the most part, except in rare exceptions, allows them to thrive in various ways. And what we should be thinking about, he says at the end of Quest for Community, are policies that will allow for a laissez-faire of groups, that will allow these groups to thrive and to compete with each other. And basically, when these social groups are competing for each other, they're competing for the loyalty of their individual members. And what that means is they're competing to basically provide a better experience of community and integration than the other one can provide. And so the question we need to be asking is, what can the state do to enable those groups to thrive? Not what can the state do to be a better community?
Right. And I think, this is maybe, as you say that, this is maybe where it overlaps with my point about the family and a business.
Yep.
If you call a business a family, it actually doesn't make the business better. It undermines the true nature of business, right? It doesn't just undermine the family, it undermines business. If you identify community with the political community, you're trying to get the state to do more than it can do and deliver more than it can deliver. So it actually creates the bad forms of the state, as opposed to having a proper form of the state and then this plurality of associations underneath it, or within it, I guess is a better way to say it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's. There's a lot we could talk about. You talk about functional communities a lot. Can you just give a quick summary about what you mean and what Nisbet means by functional communities? Because this is something I think that's important and related to this. And then I want to talk to you about some problems. So just maybe a quick summary of functional community, because I think in order to understand your argument, we need to at least talk a little bit about this idea of functional community.
Yeah, so functional community, it means a group of people who can form a community around some particular function. So people don't come together to be together, they come together to do something together. That is, they come together to properly worship God or Allah, or they come together to create children, or they come together to live together on the same street, or they come together to work together to create some product, or something like that. And that is, they're forming a function. And Nisbet says these functions have a dogma that accompany them, that is central beliefs. And it usually can be formulated very simply as something is good. So why do families form? Well, because people believe that the formation of families and the propagation or the having and raising of children is good. That's why they do it. And then they carry out that function. Why do people gather together to worship God? Because they think that worshiping God and everything that goes along with that is good. It's something people should aim for. So a functional community is a community that can perform its function. Individuals doing together the same thing, who look at each other and see each other as the same thing. We're all fellow Christians, Presbyterians or Catholics. We're your fellow Hindus. We're fellow Shians. We're fellow Millers. They see each other as the same thing in whatever it is they're carrying out. We're fellow academics, or we're fellow members of the Duquesne community, in my case. So that's what a functional community is.
Okay, and I think it's interesting. Yeah, that's good. I think because that also, I'm going to ask a couple problem questions, but I think one thing that Nisbet says, I think it's in the Quest for Community, is that that one of the problems with associations is we've lost a function. I think he talks about, or he refers to Ortega y Gasset, and even the family, like the family has lost its function. And so part of what Nisbet wants to do is reinvigorate these communities to have more proper functions. So things aren't taken over by the state or aren't taken over, say, by larger associations, because he wants all kinds of associations. And it seems, correct me if I'm misreading him, but that we really need to strengthen the function of the family and not just have it a place where you kind of hang out for 18 years until you go. But the families need to actually be more involved in doing things together.
Yeah, that's right. So one of his arguments against the growth of the state and the state's kind of welfare functions is it's taking away from the family and other groups their function. And he says without the function, they won't be able to integrate individuals. So you can say, well, now that the state has taken over education, educational responsibilities, now that it's taken over social welfare responsibilities, now the family can get down to the business of just loving each other and being together. Well, it turns out that's not how it works. If the family is not providing economically and for its members, if it's not providing educationally for its members, it's not actually able to integrate them adequately. And it loses its importance. As it loses its importance, it will lose its members' loyalty and a desire to even have that form of community. Because what's the point? So you can hang out together for the rest of your lives. What's the point of that? But if it has a function, well, then people will seek it to accomplish that function. So we need to decentralize the functions from the state back to these various associations so that they can adequately integrate individuals socially.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. I think that was well said. Okay, so let's talk two problems towards the end of your book. This is starting around page 157. You make some points of clarification. And you talk about two things. And I think going through Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, and then the 7 characters of the functional community helps us now address these problems. So you give there's 2 things that come up. One is complex associations like the Roman Catholic Church, right? So how do small associations within a large association work? What are the rights there, right? And that's the first one. And then the question of racism and what I'll just call bad communities. All right. So let's start with that. How do you think about this complex association? So you say my argument should not lead one to challenge the authority of the Catholic hierarchy on behalf of the lesser associations embedded within it, right? So, well, that's good enough. Yeah. So that there are smaller organizations within the Roman Catholic Church, and that's a good one because there's 1 billion people in it. And there's all these small organizations. How do complex associations work? What are the challenges there? And what are you saying and what are you not saying?
Yeah, good. So the idea of complex associations, so that is associations that have these other groups nested within them. Where does the right of association reside? And I would say it resides at the top of whatever the big association is. So the Catholic Church is subject to whatever its internal norms are regarding how it treats its universities, its religious orders, and its various parishes and all of that. And there's plenty of associations that are kind of large and complex. And so the question we're asking is, what's the interaction then between the state and those associations? And so I'd say, well, let's look at the whatever the top level is of that association. Catholic Church is a great example. Whatever the top is, whatever its internal norms are, that governs how it organizes itself internally. Now, this is interesting because some people have come out on behalf of the court in the CLS versus Martinez case. And they said, well, wait a second. That student group, that's just a group embedded, nested within this larger public university. And so what I say there is, well, we're talking about a public university that is a government entity constrained by the First Amendment. That has created a forum for private groups to form. Therefore, those private groups have freedom of association. So that's kind of one nuance and complication in this whole discussion.
Would that hold to say, would that hold to, I went to the University of Notre Dame.
Oh, yeah.
Would that hold to Notre Dame?
No, because Notre Dame is a private association. So the right of association then resides with Notre Dame and what Notre Dame wants to do.
Right. Okay. So sometimes, you go to a certain school, for example, and you don't like the uniform or you don't like a certain rule, and you say, "Well, we don't like the rule, but we've decided to enter this freely, so we abide by the rules of that association." That's right. I don't necessarily have to be in that association, but if I am, that association has certain rules or dogma, and I have chosen to enter it. Right. So there's both this kind of freedom, and then. But you can't, in a sense, a student group or at Notre Dame couldn't necessarily say, well, you're violating my right of association or my freedom of speech if that group is somehow embedded in the association of Notre Dame. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Unless it was a specific kind of thing, and then which we'll get to.
Right.
Or let's get to it now. What would be a case where the association is actually now violating its right? The right of a group.
Sure. So you could there might be laws. I mean, the way I treat this is, hey, look, we're looking at a balancing between individual rights, which most people see as very important, state prerogatives, which certainly the state has some legitimate functions and prerogatives, and associations. So my gripe is not that associations should have kind of ultimate power over their members or be completely sovereign, but rather that they're completely ignored. And if we kind of give them a place at the table, they'll have certain autonomous rights, but those aren't going to be absolute. There are going to be other interests that are going to be balanced against this. So you might imagine employment laws, say, that govern Notre Dame, even though it's a private institution and even though it's Catholic. There might be still certain constraints that are made upon it that the state is putting upon it to protect individuals within it and certain economic rights and that sort of thing.
Yeah, right. Okay. No, yes. You can't have slaves just because you're a Notre Dame.
That's right. That's right.
There's certain things that just like, right. Okay. But I think it's interesting and important because it's really at the heart of Nisbet too. And there's this tension. I talked about this with Brad Berzer. I think I said Brad Wilcox before. Brad Berzer, on our Nisbet podcast, that there's a tension in Nisbet that associations are essential for human flourishing and they can also tend to oppress.
Yep.
And there's this tension going on. So let's then, and I think but what you said, which I think is important, is that right now it's just individual and state. And in jurisprudence, we need to bring back associations, and also in social life and practice, we need to bring back the importance of them. And that doesn't mean that associations become the tyrants. It means that we have actually a more accurate view of social life that goes beyond simply individual and state, but includes the reality of associations, both in encouragement and in our jurisprudence. Is that right? That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So let's talk about the problem of race then, because that's another example. What do we do in association? I think you've kind of already answered it maybe here, but I think it's important to at least bring it out explicitly. What do we do with an associations that, say, for example, exclude people based on race, right? Or what? How do we deal with the? Let's bracket and say I think we can agree that a den of thieves is not a legitimate association, therefore it doesn't deserve protection, right? So I think we can agree with that part. But let's take groups that hold opinions or views that are repulsive, right? But not necessarily illegal, right?
Right.
How do you deal with that? How do you deal with this question of association and limits, and how do you address that?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So one thing that Nisbet's clear on, and it's a tension there, is of course these groups are necessary for human flourishing and they're necessary for political freedom, but they, of course, these groups can themselves be oppressive, be sources of oppression, and can be bad for individuals in their own way, and a different way from the state. The state, the big problem with the dichotomy of state and individuals, you end up with these individuals adrift and alienated, and that can cause all sorts of problems. It's a very inhumane structure. The very central meaning of that term, it's an unhuman way of being. Well, these groups can do all sorts of things for individuals, but if we give them authority over individuals, and I think that authority should reside there in this plethora of groups, a big problem is, of course, these groups can themselves be oppressive. And the state can be constrained potentially by what I'm saying and what Nisbet's saying, to be constrained in being able to actually help individuals in a way in which they actually need to be helped, in a very that would be more humane for the state to intervene. So a great example, race-based groups. What if you have a group, a racially exclusive group of some sort, and we know from our history the inhumane way in which this is played out in the Jim Crow era and all of that. So what do you do about that? That would seem to be, why can't you have a race-based group just like you can have a group based on anything else under the First Amendment and under what I'm saying about freedom of association? So what I say in the book is we can approach this pragmatically and taking into account the individual and the state as well. So I say the court, for example, in its case on Bob Jones University, where it upheld the IRS stripping that institution of tax exemption status.
Why was that? Can you just tell us what it was?
Yeah, so the Bob Jones case, Bob Jones University was a fundamentalist Christian college, or is a fundamentalist Christian college. It had policies regarding forbid interracial marriage and interracial dating, and the advocacy for interracial dating and marriage. And the court said that's acceptable for the IRS to strip it of tax exemption status. The courts upheld a series of cases in the 70s and 80s where it allowed the government to kind of take some policy actions against racially exclusive educational institutions. So this is kind of in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education and the attempt to enforce integration and all of that. And I say, look, when I'm saying about the right of association, the need for associations to be autonomous, to be able to exercise authority around whatever their dogma is and their function is, we might see situations where there's a limit to this. So I am not necessarily saying we have to overturn Bob Jones University, that case. What I'm saying is in all these sorts of areas, we need a functional autonomy. We need protection under freedom of association. But there might be certain cases where the state's interest or the individual's interest does trump the interest of the association. And so what we might look at here is race is a great example. What about the economic prospects of racial minorities that might be affected by racially exclusive schools? And that's what the court's looking at in that case. And so we might see a situation where we say, normally we would say, that no IRS, you cannot strip tax exemption from this association just because you disagree with it. So just because you disagree with Wheaton College and its policies on LGBTQ issues does not mean you get a strip it of tax exemption status. But with race, that's different given our history with Jim Crow and all of this. So we're going to allow you to strip that institution of those of tax exemption status. And I say, well, what about with student groups? So let's return to the issue of Martinez. I'm saying you have to allow student groups to form in that forum, which is where First Amendment rights apply, around whatever their group is. Well, what about a student group that's race-based? And I say, well, since it's taking place in an educational institution, we can kind of follow the Bob Jones rule, and we could allow educational institutions to not allow student groups to form on that basis. Now, the criticism here is, well, wait a second, this is inconsistent. So you should go instead have more freedom of association and allow these groups to form. Or why not take that restriction further? What about sex-based groups? What about groups that exclude on the basis of sexual orientation, as Christian Legal Society did? That was one of the requirements, in addition to their statement of faith. And I say, well, I think we can look at this. In the educational context, are women falling behind men? Are they kind of just kept out of these opportunities? Well, we know that they're not. They are doing just fine. Furthermore, does anyone really think that we need to strip Wellesley College, my former employer, of tax exemption status because it doesn't have because it's all women? It's sex exclusive. I don't think anyone wants that. And anyone looks at that and says, well, no, that would accomplish nothing for equality to do something like that. And what about people who identify as LGBTQ? Are they having all sorts of problems in higher education? Well, it looks like from the studies that have been done, no, they're not. They're doing perfectly well in terms of graduation rates and all that. So what would the state accomplish by impinging upon the associational rights of educational institutions or the associational rights of student groups if it were to intrude in that way? And I think that would be unnecessary. So what I'm trying to do, and I think people would disagree with me on both sides, saying you're being inconsistent. We want freedom of association. We got to go all the way. The Constitution requires it. And John Anazu says that. And others who say, well, no, we need to go farther with our restrictions on freedom of association. What I hope I'm doing is giving a method whereby we can kind of pragmatically approach these issues. We know freedom of association is important. We know it has a textual right. And what do we do on these kind of the issues on the edge? And I think this is a way of working through it. We can think about, I'm not saying freedom of, the interest of associations is the only interest there. What I'm saying is that we need to get it back on the table and talk about the associational rights of groups and the assembly clause. And yes, but that's okay to balance it against individual interest and even state prerogatives.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, it's a complex. I mean, a lot of these are actually, some of the things you brought up go into deep anthropological questions that
yes,
that we don't have time to discuss here. But I mean, hopefully I will talk about that at some point. So I think that's good. No, I think that's it. And I think, so I'm going to try to just summarize that you're saying generally, which I think summarized before, individual rights are important. The individual exists. There's a state, we have to do these things, but there's also associations, and associations have been neglected, and they're increasingly neglected. And if we don't pay attention to that, it's actually going to be harmful for our political life and our social life and our human flourishing. So we need to bring them back up, right? That's your key thing. It's not so much contra individual rights or contra the state as much as this is a forgotten and neglected element that must be reinvigorated. Is that fair?
Right. Yep, that's exactly
okay. So, and I think it's interesting, by the way, because now you talk about this, how you deal with the complexity. And one of the ways you deal with the complexity of this is, I think, interesting. It's completely Nisbetian. And you say, okay, well, how do you deal with, people being excluded, people doing this? And one of the answers is form an association, which I think is, if associational rights are so strong, they form an association. So this is actually on the last part of the last page of your book, 179. You said, such a court may write. Now, is this your summary when you say, do not seek to stifle those who differ from you? Or
so this is, I kind of give what I think the court should write.
It's good. I mean, do you have it in front of you? Do you want to read it, or you want me to read it?
Oh yeah, I can read it.
Okay.
So this is the last paragraph on the last page, and I'm saying, look, if the court takes what I say to heart and it addresses the Martinez issue again, here's what the court should write. Do not seek to stifle those who differ from you. If you find yourself excluded from a group for reasons of belief or practice, your rights are not violated. You are free to join another association that suits your own beliefs and practices. If you cannot find one, start your own. Freedom of association means the freedom to associate and to disassociate as you will. Then the court could quote, as Nisbet often does with approval, the radical pluralist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and adjure the university and its students. Multiply your associations and be free. With that, the Supreme Court of the United States could put the social into freedom of association.
Right. I think it's a strong end, not only to your book, but also to the conflicts that come about. How do we deal with the fact? Well, if there's freedom of association, then there's freedom of association, which means you start new associations to deal with these questions. And I think it's something that we oftentimes think, well, how come I can't be a part of this? Okay, you can't be a part of that, but you could start something else. And I think that needs to be encouraged, both for political liberty and for social health. Well, Luke, this is really great. Thanks for taking the time to address this really complex question. And I'm glad we were at the end able to kind of wrestle with things, because it's important. There's not an immediate simple solution, right? I think we often want a technical solution to all of our problems. Here's the turnkey technical solution. And I like how you say, well, I don't have a technical turnkey solution. Social life is complex, human life is complex, political liberty is complex, and we can, approximate ways of doing it, and reinvigorating associations is, I think, a part of it. But you're not promising, and I think in Nisbetian fashion, you're not promising a perfect technical solution to the problems of life.
That's right.
So good. Well, Luke, thank you very much for taking the time to be on the Moral Imagination podcast. Appreciate it. Just real quick, the name of your book is Why Associations Matter, The Case for First Amendment Pluralism. And also, where else can people find you? Any important essays you want to promote? And I can put those up as links on the Moral Imagination website.
Oh, sure. Well, I have an article that's come out this summer, Quest for Revolutionary Community at Law and Liberty, where I discuss applying kind of Nisbet's idea of the revolutionary community to the turmoil that we've seen over the last several months. And I have another article, as of this recording of this podcast, it should be out shortly, over on the Real Clear Conglomerate, where I'll talk about freedom of associations and its history in American society.
Oh, great. Okay. I will put those up as links at themoralimagination.com. Luke, thanks again for joining.
No, thank you.